this is a big irony that I left India 20 years back. I went to the UK to study, to understand capitalism, to understand the morality of capitalism. And 20 years later, things have changed so much in the West that here I am again trying to tell people what morality is in capitalism. So West was a moral, Western civilization was based on a moral system and seems to be drifting away from it. Now, today's topic should ideally have been capitalist liberty and morality. Instead, we chose to have it as capitalism and morality. And the reason is that liberty has come to be associated with so many things, so many freebies, free education, free healthcare. And that's not what morality is. Morality is about self-responsibility. And so capitalism is actually a very key ingredient of morality, and that's why we want to have this topic as capitalism and morality. Now, when I see politicians talking about social engineering plans, I always feel anxious, and that's why I don't watch TV much. And then I see these people in the background clapping when the politicians make put forth crazy ideas, and my anxiety goes up even further. And they are euphoric, the public who claps there. And the huge difference is that one person, me, feels anxious, and these people feel euphoric. What is the difference? Because I'm a capitalist, I know what I'm working for is going to get stolen. The socialist is thinking that he will get something from me. Unfortunately, he's going to get nothing. The only person going to benefit from this is the politician and his best buddy, the corporatist. I mean, in my opinion, and this is what my grandparents thought, and this is what I thought, Western civilization was the greatest civilization on earth, but it's no longer the case anymore. It's increasingly becoming anti-capitalist, and as long as it continues to become anti-capitalist, it will become immoral, and social decay will continue to happen in this country. Now, I just want to, for semantic precision, I just want to define a few words to avoid confusion during the day. Most of the speakers will probably agree with what I'm defining, but I have, unfortunately, a confrontational approach, and that's because of my own upbringing, I think. But Larry is a very optimistic person, and I am, unfortunately, not that optimistic, and that's the reason why I have a confrontational approach. But I'll define words my way, and I'm looking forward to Larry's speak after that. Now, who is a beggar? A beggar is a person who goes, requests for money, begs for someone's generosity, and he usually says thank you. Who is a thief? A thief steals your property and coercively, and but there is one good thing about the thief. He takes the risk of his trade. But there is a guy called the socialist. He steals property from you because he expects free education, free healthcare, all the freebies in the world. And he uses the facade of the government to steal that money from you. And while he steals the money from you, in the system he has created, he doesn't even take the risk of being a thief. That's what a socialist is to me. Now, socialist creates, institutionalizes what comes next. Because of what socialist wants, he gets government to create regulations and taxes, which creates a swath of bureaucrats who want to regulate you and tax you. And that creates a situation in which only crooks can do businesses anymore. Good people move out of the system. They can't run businesses anymore. And then what you have is a corporatist system left. Capitalist, on the other hand, is a very different kind of guy. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the government. He wants to create value. He wants to sell what he makes for the maximum possible price and produce it at the lowest possible cost. He might run a sweatshop, but the people who work for him because they couldn't find anything better. If they had found something better, they would have gone elsewhere. So that's what a capitalist does. Now, the interesting thing is that 2 decades back, when I first went to the UK in 1991, often come across this socialist. The socialist would tell me that all these multinational companies were going to India, investing in those countries and exploiting the poor people in that country. Making them work in bad environment, unhealthy environment, dingy places. This is what the socialist used to tell me those days. Now the socialist comes to me and he says, I hate it that multinational companies are demeaning Indians because they are making them work in these air-conditioned health centers by making them feign American accent. Now, the irony of the whole thing is that in this exaggerated perspective, Indian sweatshop workers have moved up from sweatshops to air-conditioned call centers, whereas the socialist is still standing on the street whining. I would like to introduce you to Larry Reid. When I have been following Larry Reid for a while. I hate hero worshipping, but unfortunately I have become a fan of several people, and he's one of them. When I first heard him, I thought that this person had been to India, he understood the problems of the country, but there are things which are not a function of space and time. They are universal principles, and this is what Larry is going to talk about. What makes a society moral, a society of character, which are the foundations to make a society that progresses and creates wealth and prosperity. So it's my enormous pleasure to invite Mr. Reid. Welcome.
Thank you, Giant. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to be with you in this beautiful city. And I certainly agree with you, Giant, when it comes to politics and politicians, some of the remarks you offered this morning. And I don't know if you all know the origin of the word politics, but I heard, I think it was Ed Crane from Cato some years ago, put it very well. He said it comes in two parts. Poly, the Greek word for many, in ticks, meaning blood-sucking parasites. And those of us who talk about politics and government find ourselves so often talking about unintended consequences, about things that happened differently from what the central planners first intended, which reminds me of another story that at this hour of the morning I should share with you so as to get the juices going. It's a story about unintended consequences. There was a woman who had a pet parrot. And this parrot was a very talkative bird, and it had a bad habit of saying repeatedly, especially when she had friends over, it would say, "Say fellas, I'm a swinger." Actually, I've sanitized it just for you, because what I heard was a little bit more off color than that. But it would say this repeatedly, and so finally she decided to see her priest about this. And her priest said, "Oh, this is no trouble at all. I have two parrots of my own. They are the most pious, religious birds you'll ever meet. They say their prayers, they say the rosary, they have their beads. You leave your parrot with my two, and in no time at all, mine will straighten her out." So she left her parrot with those two, and sure enough, after a few minutes, her parrot said, "Say fellas, I'm a swinger," whereupon one of the other parrots turned to the next one and said, "Put your beads away, Charlie, our prayers have been answered." Well, a special thanks to Giant and his crew of volunteers. I've had the pleasure of meeting not only Giant for the first time, we've been Facebook friends for a good while, but many of the folks here today who have been involved in making this happen. And you should never underestimate the work, the anxiety, sometimes even the agony, and certainly the expense that people who take it upon themselves to make an event of 50 or 60 people happen. You should never underestimate that dedication, and I'm deeply grateful for it. And let me ask all of you to give Giant and his crew a show of hands. I have another story before I get into my main remarks that I want to share with you, because it sums up, I think, the spirit of our entire day today. And it's a true story. It goes back to testimony given from a developer from Louisiana in Congress some years ago. He was explaining the difficulties that he had in getting all the various approvals from various levels of bureaucracy. He had been planning a construction project for quite some time. He had to secure the approval first of no fewer than 23 local and county and state agencies before he could begin. So he did all that, and just when he thought that everything was ready to go, he learned that he also had to apply for approval from the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington. So he and his attorney filled out all of those forms and sent them off to the agency, whereupon he got this letter back from Washington. We received today your letter enclosing application for your client in support of abstract of title. We have observed, however, that you have not traced the title to the property previous to 1803. Before final approval can be granted, you must trace the title prior to that year. Well, you can imagine how outraged he was at this example of bureaucratic foot dragging. And so he fired off the following letter back to HUD, to the federal agency, which has in the years since has become somewhat of a classic. Dear gentlemen, your letter regarding title has been received. I noted that you wished title to be traced further back than I have done. Well, I was unaware that any educated man failed to know that Louisiana was purchased from France in 1803. But he doesn't end there. He goes on to trace the title. And the next paragraph reads, the title to that land was acquired by France by right of conquest from Spain. The land came into the possession of Spain by right of discovery in 1492 by an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus. The good Queen Isabella had taken the precaution of securing the blessing of the Pope of Rome upon Columbus's voyage before she sold her jewels to help him. The Pope, in turn, is the emissary of Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God. God made the world. I think it's safe to assume that God created that part of the world known as the United States and that part of the United States known as Louisiana, and I hope the hell you're satisfied. That's tracing the title back about as far as you could go. I would like to engage in a little exercise here that will fit into the message of my talk, an exercise that will involve most, if not all of you. The task will be to get each of you to participate in about 30 seconds or less. And here is the exercise. I don't want to presume that all of you would say that you are a believer in liberty and limited government and free enterprise. I don't know the mix of ideological persuasions we may have here. So I don't want to put any pressure on anyone, but those of you who have come to the general perspective, friendly, favorable to ideas of liberty, I would like to know something about what brought you, what was your moment when a light went on? What turned you on first to these ideas and got you going down this path? As you think about that, and we'll go around the room for and just ask for volunteers who would like to offer some thoughts in 30 seconds or less. But I'll share with you while you're thinking of your occasion that brought you to liberty, what brought me to liberty some 40 plus years ago. How many of you have seen the movie, The Sound of Music? Yeah, almost everybody has. I saw it in 1965 at the age of 14. We were living not far from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and my mother one day said, we're going to go up to Pittsburgh, about 40 miles away, and see this new movie, The Sound of Music. And I remember not wanting to go. I thought of it, just the title of it sounded like, what is this, a bunch of people singing and dancing? Well, a 14-year-old has better things to do than to go to Pittsburgh and see such a movie. But we went, and something clicked with me, and it changed my life. Believe it or not, as corny as it may sound. If you see the movie, you know that it's about, based on a true story, the von Trapp family that fled Hitler's Germany after the Anschluss, which annexed Austria to the Nazi Empire in 1938. And I look back on this and I wonder, well, why did that touch me so much? I saw it as, perfectly wonderful group of people who just wanted to be left alone, and along comes this rotten regime from a nearby country and swallows up the country and tries to draft the father into its military. I saw it in kind of libertarian terms, you might say, and I felt great sympathy for the situation that family found themselves in. And looking back on it, I think perhaps growing up in Western Pennsylvania, this was probably the first time that it was ever made apparent to me that there are lots of people in the world who don't live like we do, who have much less freedom than we do, and who go through literally hell to either restore it or to get it for the first time. And I took an interest in that. I'm not sure why. Neither of my parents were ever very ideological. They were just good, hardworking, down-home, salt-of-the-earth people who didn't think much about politics or policy, just didn't expect anybody to give them a living and worked hard for one themselves. Maybe they planted the right instincts, but I saw that movie in terms of its powerful pro-liberty message. Even the lyrics of some of the tunes, if you listen carefully, are very appealing to a libertarian. Climb every mountain, ford every stream, travel every byway till you find your dream. I mean, it's all a very optimistic message. At least that's the way I took it. So I started reading history of pre-World War II Europe, wanting to know more about that period. And I read everything I could at ages 15, 16, 17. And then in 1968, Prague Spring began to develop, not in Austria, where the movie was based, but next door in Czechoslovakia. How many remember, many of you are old enough to remember Prague Spring, when the world began to focus its attention on this country in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Central Europe, where the regime was talking about opening things up, allowing greater freedom, freedoms of speech and assembly and press, and even began late in the spring talking about the possibility of free elections. And I was cheering this on, thinking, wow, this is great. Will the Soviets leave them alone? That was the big question throughout the summer of 1968, because there were rumors that this growing freedom in Czechoslovakia would be snuffed out by Warsaw Pact troops, and just as they had done to Hungary in 1956. So those of us who believed in liberty were cheering on the Czechs, hoping they would be left alone and this thing could really blossom. I remember when Brezhnev from the Soviet Union came to Bratislava and had a conference with Alexander Dubček, the leader of the Czechs in 1968. This was in early August. And at that conference, he basically said, oh, what, invade? We invade? We wouldn't do that. No, you can do what you want. Go ahead. And then less than 3 weeks later, it was 10 o'clock in the evening my time when I first learned of this. I was walking down the hallway in our home past my parents' bedroom, and my father said, hey, come here. He had the radio on next to the bed. He turned it up, and we listened to the first reports that we had heard that day of Soviet and Warsaw Pact troops crossing the border, invading Czechoslovakia. I still get goosebumps when I even talk about it. And I remember how I felt. I was incensed. All I could think of were perfectly innocent people who wanted nothing more than to be free, being crushed by Soviet tanks. I wanted to do something. But what could a 15, 16-year-old do facing a situation like that halfway around the world? But within days, I read a little blurb in our local paper announcing that a group called Young Americans for Freedom was going to have a demonstration in downtown Pittsburgh in Mellon Square to protest the Soviet invasion. And I said, I'm going to get a ticket, bus ticket, and go up to Pittsburgh and be a part of that. And we burned the Soviet flag in Mellon Square, and, which, you know, was a bold move for, what was I, 15, 16 years of age. And I remember the local television station, one of them had a camera crew there to film our demonstration, and the groundskeeper came up right in the midst of it, and he said, you can't do that, put that out. Kind of ruined our television debut. But in any event, I joined Young Americans for Freedom, which at that time gave to its new members a package of books and a magazine. The books included Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, The Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek, The Mainspring of Human Progress by Henry Grady Weaver, and The Law by Frederick Bastiat. And the magazine was The Freeman, which is published by the organization I now head. If somebody had told me on that day in 1968, someday you'll be president of the outfit that publishes this magazine, I would have said, you're nuts. But the message there was, if you want to be an anti-communist, if you want to really have a deep-seated, fundamental, principled solidarity with people who want their liberty, you can't just be a knee-jerk, I don't like that regime kind of guy. You have to understand economics, you have to understand moral philosophy, you have to understand history and political science. You need to know these things before you can be an effective spokesperson on behalf of liberty in all of its aspects. So that's what got me started. I trace it back to a movie. Now, hopefully you've given a little thought to what might have sparked you, and if you have an especially notable moment that you can tell us about and can do so in 30 seconds or less. Let's take maybe about 10. Maybe we won't be able to do everybody. But what was it? A book, a teacher, a movie, or something else? Yes, sir. Jeremy.
I'm Jeremy Davis. I'm from Houston, Texas. Texas is a whole other country. But anyway, when I was 8 years old in 1943, during World War II, the good war, I took the bus at one of 2 stores in my town, and my store had bubble gum. So I bought 10 pieces for 10 cents, 1 cent a piece. An hour later, I sold them for 10 cents a piece on the schoolyard. That lasted 2 days before the principal made me stop. That's correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks for coming all the way from Houston. Next, anyone else? Yes, sir.
Well, I was a child of the 60s, I guess, a pretty typical one. And when I was 18, about 40 years ago, I was working in a mining exploration camp in northern Canada, freezing to death. And I was studying up a copy of Das Kapital by Marx, just to become a more moral person, I thought. And this other scruffy-looking fellow came up to me and he said, "Why don't you read some of this stuff instead?" And he started feeding me books by Ayn Rand. And it took me a while to kind of really get how, you know, the contradiction here and understand it, but eventually I think the first thing I really saw was that a morality that I thought required force to impose, there was something fundamentally wrong with. And from there, that's really where I started. 2 years later, I remember standing on a platform in West Berlin looking over the Berlin Wall at that incredible barrier that had been constructed to stop freedom, and listening to an escaped guard tell us about all the different people who had tried or successfully made it across. And that was a real measure of how far I had shifted in those intervening 2 years.
Ah, wonderful, wonderful. Yes, sir.
I think my exposure to free enterprise rather than freedom was family. My grandfather came over from Poland with arguably about $1 in his pocket and built an successful industrial company. My father, perhaps more of a lesson there, was an oral surgeon who became a pediatric dentist and whose practice was completely ruined by the National Health Scheme, on which he was actually Secretary of the Defense Committee, which is the British Medical Council's advisory committee, where he had a pediatric practice, and when the National Health Scheme was introduced, no specialty was allowed for dentistries. So he went on Friday from having a waiting room of parents and children and looking after the mouths of children. And on Monday morning, he approached his practice and found this long lineup outside and a waiting room that was completely full. And these were 60-year-olds whose mouths had never been looked at by a dentist, who said to him, "Fix my mouth." And he was out of dentistry in 2 years and went into business.
Oh, my. The good old National Health Service. I heard somebody a while back saying if America ever goes full measure to state-run healthcare, we will combine the efficiency of the post office with the compassion of the IRS in healthcare. I'll have some stories about Poland that you may appreciate in a little while. Yes, sir.
I was born and raised in Chile and went to university there first. And I had nothing, so I was a socialist during the school time, right? Great protests, you know, in support of Cuba and everything, fight the police, you know. And one day I needed some cash, so I started a little pocket money. I started a cheese and butter distribution business, home distribution. Started making a bit of money. And started saving a bit of money while I was going to school. And very quickly I became a capitalist.
That's wonderful. I have a cheese and butter story for you very quickly. Growing up in western Pennsylvania, we had in our state at that time laws designed to prevent milk and dairy products from neighboring states coming into Pennsylvania to be sold. And I remember, and by the way, Pennsylvania famously had the red dye law, which said that you could bring milk in from other states and sell it in Pennsylvania, but only if you dyed it red first. And of course, you can imagine, you know, who lobbied for that? It wasn't the consumer. But we lived about 11 miles from a little town in Ohio called Negley. It was a dairy town. And on weekends, my father would frequently take us by car over to Negley. We'd buy milk and bring it back. And some of it, you know, we usually brought a lot. Some of it we'd sell to the neighbors. And he would tell us, keep the milk down, keep it covered. If we get pulled over, you know, don't say anything about the milk. And us kids thought it was phenomenal. Wow, we feel like, you know, we're doing something exciting. We're smuggling milk into Pennsylvania. And that was one of my earliest interactions with the state. Any others? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually where I stand on the ideological spectrum at the moment, but certainly my suspicion of bureaucracy came about coming out of the cooperative movement. I've been involved in a number of co-ops and have developed a very visceral understanding of how a consumer cooperative that is supposed to be dedicated to the interests of its members is inexorably and inevitably taken over by the interests of the staff. And in Vancouver here, of course, we have a number of very large cooperatives in which this is easily observable. I was fortunate to learn it in a very grassroots sort of food co-op environment. And shortly after I had sort of started, this forced me to question a number of sort of habitual beliefs I'd come out of a very socialist upbringing with. I started taking my kids to school and becoming an involved parent, where I was able to observe exactly the same behavioral phenomena on a much larger scale, and the lessons were immediately transferable, and then of course from education they're transferable to a much wider perspective as well. So I'm still on the path there somewhere.
Okay, hey, thank you very much. Let's take one or two more. Any others? Yes, sir.
John. I was in the Army for a long time. I was NATO operations in Europe during the Cold War, and then I went to the Mozambique War. Kind of learned through my own experience of doing Army intelligence that a state that's big enough to kill you will. So I became anti-state. I didn't become libertarian, and it took me about 6-7 years after that before I ran into these guys in Edmonton called the Liberty Lounge. And they studied all the great thinkers, and that was a fairly easy transition for me.
Great, thank you. You know, and one more. Lilia.
Hi, I'm Lilia Valles. I was born in Lithuania, and during times of invasion, Soviet invasion, the tanks we were talking about, and Lithuania has a long, long history of people invading. It's on the Baltic Sea, and the Russians had always wanted access to the sea. And so there's a resistance. The people have acquired a resistance to other people forcing their way on them and taking over. So they've been resisting oppression and control by others, by foreigners, for thousands of years, and I think it's in the blood of Lithuanians. I have cousins who have gone to school, who were born under communism, attended the public schools, listened to all the lectures of their instructors, had no counterbalancing forces, and none of them were brainwashed, none of them believed a word that they were told. So I kind of laugh when people say, the system here in democracy just brainwashes you. People can't think for themselves, and I think, gee, there's so many choices here. You can think what you like, but that people, even under a very structured, repressive system, still resisted, still didn't accept. So I think there's a spark of freedom within individuals that is very comforting, hopeful.
Yes. Thank you very much, Lily. I've asked that question of many audiences over the years, and I think there are multiple lessons that come from the exercise. One is that you just don't know what might bring someone to ideas of liberty. But in any event, if you have come to those ideas, it's important, if you want to change the world on liberty's behalf, to be at the ready. At the moment someone in your midst, in your presence, within your sphere of influence shows even the slightest spark of interest in these ideas. Be at the ready, both in terms of the literature you can provide, the direction you can give them, and the personal example that you provide is critically important too, as the remainder of this talk, I think, will make it plain. So thank you for being a part of that exercise, and as we get through the day, maybe it will become even more obvious why it's important to know more about what brings people to these ideas and how to nurture them once that spark has been lit. This talk today on liberty and character is a kind of big picture talk, and it's a little out of character, you might say, to some degree, for me as an economist. I'm not a moral philosopher, I'm not a theologian. My specialty is economic history, and yet I find myself in recent years being drawn more and more to topics of character and the connection between character and liberty. And the more deeply I think about these things, I have to tell you as a libertarian, the more I'm convinced that this is the main problem we must confront. That all the other problems we talk about that occupy so much of our attention these days, such as the economic calamities, the housing bust, the spending in Ottawa or Washington, the growth of government, all of those things, bad as they are, as absorbing as they are, they're not the big picture. They themselves are symptoms of something much more fundamental that we have to grasp and wrestle with and fix if we can expect to ever solve these economic and political problems. Another way to put it is that I think people are focused these days on some trees, but they are ignoring the forest. One tree is the housing bust, another tree is what's happening in Congress, and so on and so forth. These are all important. They're big trees. But there's a blight on the forest. And if we ignore that blight, and it doesn't matter what we do to tinker with those problems, those other problems I mentioned, they won't get solved if we don't fix this blight. And I'm talking about a serious erosion of character. Serious erosion of character. The blight from which we're suffering is an erosion of that character, and it's at the root of all of our major economic and social troubles today. Let me share with you some findings of a study from the Josephson Institute. And there may be something comparable to it in Canada, I don't know. But this is an institute that every 2 years for the past 30 or more has done a survey of high school seniors, tens of thousands of them all across the United States. I don't mean to pick on young people. I think these trends would probably be found among older generations as well. But because it focuses on young people, we should especially pay attention, because this may say something about our future. But they ask students questions that hopefully will reveal something of their attitudes toward basic foundational moral principles. 23%, and by the way, these numbers have gotten progressively worse. Almost every 2 years that the study's been conducted, the numbers get worse. 23% said that they stole something from a parent or other relative. And 20% confessed they stole something from a friend. More than 2 of 5, about 42%, said that they sometimes lie to save money. Cheating in school continues to be rampant, and it's getting worse. A substantial majority, 64%, said that they cheated on a test during the past year. 38% said they did so 2 or more times. More than 1 in 3 said that they used the internet to plagiarize an assignment. And on it goes. As bad as these numbers are, it appears they may understate the level of dishonesty exhibited by America's youth. More than 1 in 4 confessed that they lied on at least 1 or 2 questions on the survey. And experts agree that dishonesty on surveys usually is an attempt to conceal misconduct. And despite these high levels of dishonesty, the respondents had a very high self-image when it came to ethics. A whopping 93% said they were, quote, satisfied with my personal ethics and character. And 77% said that when it comes to doing what is right, I'm better than most people that I know. That's just one little snapshot of one aspect of our society that I think we should be concerned about. It's one little bit of evidence of an erosion of character. More evidence and commentary, of course, will be in the remainder of my talk today. We use the term character in different ways, don't we? Some people have character, some people are characters, and some of those characters don't have any character. But I'm using the term in its positive sense, referring to certain traits of personality that most people, even if they would admit they don't fully measure up themselves, they would admit that nonetheless those are traits that they wish more people would exhibit. They'd like to live in a society where those traits are more commonly held and practiced. Your character is not defined by what you say that you believe. Talk is cheap. It's defined by the actual choices that you make, and especially the choices that you make in tough situations. If you could somehow add up all of your choices, they would roughly approximate your character. If you say you're honest, but you cut corners, you lie, you prevaricate, or you steal when you can get away with it, you have subtracted substantially from your character. Now, this is important to liberty, because in the larger scheme of things, history shows us that when a people allow an erosion of their character to take place, they become putty in the hands of tyrants and demagogues. People of strong character can resist the blandishments of tyrants and demagogues. People of low character will be quick to fall for them. You know, we like to say that our system is one of self-government. The civics textbooks we've all learned from talk admirably about self-government. Isn't that a great system? And they talk about it in terms of what that means politically. But you know, self-government politically can't happen unless there is first self-government personally. If you do not govern yourself, believe me, you will be governed. There are plenty of people in the world who are more than happy to take your liberty from you at the drop of a hat and on the flimsiest of excuses. And if they can say it's because something is wrong with you, they may make progress in convincing others that your liberty should be denied. 20 years ago, something quite remarkable happened in a little town in Georgia, not far from where I now live, the little town of Conyers, Georgia. When school officials there discovered that one of their basketball players who had played 45 seconds in the first of the school's 5 postseason games had actually been scholastically ineligible, they returned the state championship trophy that the team had won just a few weeks before. If they'd simply kept quiet, probably no one else would have ever known about it, and they could have retained the trophy. But to their eternal credit, the team and the town, and dejected though they were, rallied behind the school's decision. The coach said this: "We didn't know he was ineligible at the time, but you've got to do what's honest and right and what the rules say. I told my team that people forget the scores of the games, but they never forget what you're made of. Now, in the minds of most, it didn't matter that the championship title was forfeited. The coach and the team were still champions, and in more ways than one. And I often wonder how many of us in the same situation could muster the courage and integrity to behave as they did in that one. I don't think they'll ever regret behaving the way they did, making that painful decision, and they'll probably be talking about it and influencing positively a lot of people for maybe more than one generation to come. Here's something from a commencement address I gave a couple years ago to students. I've never figured out how to say it actually better than I did on that occasion, so I'm going to read it to you verbatim, but it's relevant to audiences of any age, not just the students that I was addressing. I told them this: I want to talk to you about one thing that is more important than all the good grades you've earned, more important than all the high school and college degrees you'll accumulate, and indeed more important than all the knowledge you'll ever absorb in your lifetimes. It's something over which every responsible thinking adult has total personal control, and yet millions of people at the drop of a hat sacrifice it every year, and for very little. It will not only define and shape your future, it will put either a concrete floor or an iron ceiling over it. It's what a concrete floor under it or an iron ceiling over it. It's not what the world will remember you for. It's what the world will remember you for more than probably anything else. It's not your looks, it's not your talents, it's not your ethnicity, and it may not have anything to do with anything you ever say. And this incredibly powerful thing I'm talking about is character. Let me get more specific to what it is, or what it looks like when you don't have it. When a person spurns his conscience and fails to do what he knows is right, he subtracts from his character. When he evades his responsibilities, succumbs to temptation, foists his problems and his burdens on others, or fails to exert self-discipline, he subtracts from his character. When he attempts to reform the world without reforming himself first, he subtracts from his character. Now, what are the elements of strong character? And incidentally, one of the points I'm leading up to here is not just that character is critical to a free society, but character is critical to your ability to influence others. Because more than by anything else, people tend to learn from examples in their midst. They learn from the character of those around them. You can give them books about these things, but what influences them most, especially when they're young, are the examples set by those around them. It's hard to imagine someone growing up and respecting the property of others if they haven't been raised in an environment where property is elevated to a lofty level and where disrespect for it is admonished. That's just one example. But what are the elements of strong character? I'll give you several, and I don't mean to suggest that these are the only elements of strong character. They're simply the ones I want to cite and in some cases say a little bit of elaboration about. Here are several. Honesty, humility, responsibility, principle. That may sound a little odd to throw that in there, but I'll focus on that in a moment. Honesty, humility, responsibility, principle, self-discipline, courage, self-reliance, optimism, and a long-term focus. Those are at least my favorites when it comes to the elements I like to talk about, but they're not by any means a complete list here. Honesty, humility, responsibility, principle, self-discipline, courage, self-reliance, optimism, a long-term focus. I contend that a truly free society is just not possible if those traits are not widely practiced, passed on to the next generation, and upheld as strong, admirable virtues to be emulated. Just think of the opposite. What happens when you don't have these virtues of character I've highlighted? The opposite of honesty, dishonesty. Dishonest people will lie, they'll cheat, and they'll become bigger liars and cheaters in public office. There's nothing about being elected to government that says that the moment you get there, you become better than the people who sent you. In fact, you have to fight all the inherent temptations to be even worse. And so if you don't go with strong character in the first place, you probably will be in deep trouble. People who lack humility, what do they look like? People who lack humility become the arrogant, condescending, disrespectful, know-it-all central planner types who think they know what's best for everybody else, even if they've made a mess of their own lives. Irresponsible citizens blame others for the consequences of their own poor judgment. I mentioned self-discipline. Well, people who don't discipline themselves invite the intrusive control of others. Those who abandon self-reliance become easily manipulated by those on whom they become dependent. I mentioned optimism. I'm firmly convinced that's a strong and necessary trait of character. Well, the opposite, pessimism, or pessimists, how do they behave? They dismiss what individuals can accomplish when given the freedom to try. They give up. They concede to others who will be happy to determine their future for them. Myopic or short-sighted citizens who don't have that long-term focus, what do? They're quick to mortgage the future of their children and grandchildren for some solution for the moment, for self-gratification now. There are a lot of ways in which the erosion of these character traits are showing up painfully in our society. And of course, the more obvious ones involve violent crime. But there are a lot of other more subtle ways and not so subtle ways in which they show up. I'm going to, in fact, argue that what we're dealing with in Washington, and maybe in Ottawa as well, with this growth of government and spending and all this intrusive regulatory penchant that we're dealing with, is itself a sign, a symptom of the erosion of character. It's what people who lack character do to other people. It's a character problem first and foremost. Another way that this shows up is, here's a very mundane example. You've all gone to a Best Buy store or something like it and bought an iPod or something that comes in those absolutely impenetrable plastic packages. You know what I'm talking about? You end up cutting yourself when you try to get it. Every time I wrestle with one of those, I think, well, maybe I'm not supposed to get into this. I'm just supposed to bring the thing home and set it on the shelf. Why do manufacturers put these things in that kind of stuff and make it hard to get into? It's a character problem, isn't it? It's to avoid a problem in society of apparently too many people who are looking for ways to get something for nothing, who are disrespectful of the property of others. One tiny way, but you can magnify that many times over in many different ways, and you get a sense for the price we pay in terms of bad character. Bad character, the absence of the traits that I mentioned, or their erosion, leads to bad economics, which is bad for liberty. And ultimately, whether we live free and in harmony with the laws of economics or stumble in the dark thrall of serfdom is not so much a political or an economic or a philosophical issue as it is a character issue. People who lack character will not be free. It's as simple as that. They will vote for people who will steal on their behalf. People who lack character will not have the patience to allow things to take care of themselves. They want instant gratification at other people's expense, and on and on. I want to focus on some of these traits and give life to them a bit by sharing some stories about people who have exhibited them in such a mighty way that they become good examples. In fact, I'm a firm believer that libertarians should devote some of their reading to the biographies of great men and women who have exhibited great character, whether it be courage or humility or responsibility or self-discipline, because we learn so much by the examples of others. We're inspired by them, we're motivated by them. And I want to give you some of those stories here now. Some of the people I'll mention I have known personally, and I will tell you about at least one of those in the afternoon segment today as kind of a follow-up to this talk. But others I know of only through the history books that I have read about them. I mentioned honesty. Let me give you an example there, an example of honesty. This is one from personal experience. It involves somebody I actually knew briefly, and I'll always regret that I didn't faithfully try to find out how I could stay in touch with him. How many of you have seen the movie, The Killing Fields? Okay, I urge you to see that. It's now 20-some years old. But it's based on a true story of a Cambodian who endured most of the 3.5 years of the rule of the Khmer Rouge communists in the late 1970s. Boy, there was a radical egalitarian society that determined right from the start that they were going to remake society, that they knew what was best for everybody. You weren't even going to possess anything unless the government knew about it. Everybody was going to have roughly the same, except for those at the top. They're special. They have to live well, so they know how to govern you. And they even changed the calendar. 1975 became the year zero. They were going to remake everything. Well, in the 3.5 years in which the Khmer Rouge dictated over that society, upwards of 1.5, maybe as many as 2 million of the 8 million people in this country perished. This is what happens when a group of people get in charge with this idea that, hey, all it takes is a barrel of a gun and I can remake society the way I want to shape it. People have no respect for the lives and the property of others. That philosophy really reached its zenith in that regime in 3.5 years in the late 1970s. And the result was absolute, total chaos, tyranny, and bloodshed. Well, the man who won an Oscar for his role in The Killing Fields, Dr. Hang S. Noor, was a good friend of mine. He was a native Cambodian who himself had escaped from the Khmer Rouge in 1978 and endured, before he was able to escape, torture, the loss of his wife and his arms, unspeakable cruelty at the hands of this regime. And he had not been back to Cambodia in about 10 years when he asked me to go with him in 1989. And we went back to Cambodia, and being able to see it not only through my eyes but through his was quite an experience and a speech in itself. But in the days leading up to my departure, I was raising some money and getting the local medical folks in Midland, Michigan, where I lived, to donate some medicines to take back with me to Cambodia. And so that made the newspaper, and a woman called me and said, our church here has helped 3 Cambodian families who were refugees over the years, and we know that they would love if you could take some letters and money back with you and try to get it to their families, because every time they try to send something, it doesn't get there, it gets opened and so forth. But would you try to find these 3 families and give them some letters and some money? I said, I'd be happy to do my best. And she said, well, don't come back with any of the money. If you can't get to all the families, leave the money with whoever you think needs it, because we know that there are great needs there. We don't want the money back. I found 2 of the 3 families, no trouble. The third was way out far from Phnom Penh in the hinterlands in a place called Battambang. And on the day before I was to leave the country, it was apparent I wasn't going to get out there. So what was I to do with this letter and $200 in it? There was a man a Cambodian who I had befriended because he was often outside the lobby waiting to take people in his little rickshaw. He spoke good enough English, we could converse a little bit. I knew he didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, but he seemed like a decent man, and something moved me to give him that letter and that money. And I said to him, if you can get this letter and the $200 to that family in Battambang, you keep $50 of it for your time and trouble. It would involve, for instance, a $10 train ride to get out there and back. And now, most people would have thought, that would be the end of that. And so I left the country, gave him that before I left. 6 months or so later, the woman who first called me in Midland about the families that her church had helped, she called all excited. She said, Larry, I want to read for you a letter from that family in Battambang that they sent to their family back here and have since shared with me. And one paragraph of it said, line said, thank you for sending the $200. That man who didn't have 2 nickels not only got the money to them, he didn't even keep the $50 that I said he could keep. Now, that, to me, I've often thought about that. That touched me greatly. I thought, there's an honest man. If I know nothing else about that man, but if I were ever put in a position where I felt I had to trust my life to him, I think I probably would. That's an example of honesty that I think will never leave me. I value that. That tells me a lot about that man and the trust that I think anybody could probably put in it. I mentioned principle as another of these traits. And what do I mean by that? I mean the importance of standing for something, of not going through life thinking, well, I'll stand for whatever others will fall for, or I'm for this today, I'll be for something else tomorrow. It all depends on what serves me at the moment. Or there are no absolutes, it's whatever seems to work for the moment for this or that group. Or I don't believe in anything strong enough to give up anything on its behalf. Don't go through life like that. That is such a vapid, worthless existence to go through life like that, never being able to say there's something you believe in, that you're willing to stand for, fight for, die for. Having principles, knowing what you believe, deciding, look, I don't know everything, but I can know something. I know that there are certain truths, and by them I will stand. That's important. That makes life, I think, worth living, worth emulating. It's the kind of thing that inspires others. Don't be like that character played by Groucho Marx, and I don't mean to castigate Groucho. I'm a Marxist, a Groucho Marxist. I love Groucho Marx. But he played the leader of a fictional country in one of his films, and he's speaking to a group and he says, those are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others. Don't be like that. Decide what it is you stand for. Hopefully it'll be liberty, and something you'll not compromise on its essential truth at any occasion. Believe in something. So I got to thinking when I first put this talk together, well, who could I cite as an example of a man or woman of principle, and whose sticking to principle was firm, consistent, and thereby worth studying and emulating. And the man I came up with was Grover Cleveland. He's my favorite president. How many have never heard of Grover Cleveland? Never heard of Grover Cleveland? Well, you probably heard of him, but you don't probably know very much about him, right? He's, if you ask the typical American, well, what do you know about Grover Cleveland? If they know anything, they might say, well, he was president, that's true. They might even say he was president twice, but not back to back, that's true. The only president to serve 2 terms that were not consecutive. He was first elected in 1884. He lost in 1888 for re-election, even though he had more popular votes than the other guy. He came back and ran against the incumbent in 92 and beat him, served a 2nd term. Some Americans might say, well, wasn't he a great big president? And he was. He's the 2nd heaviest in American history at about 270 pounds. But that was a far cry from the 350 that William Howard Taft weighed in at. And he even had to be pried out of the White House bathtub on one occasion. Literally, they had to pry him out and they built another bathtub for him. A few years ago in Grand Rapids, there was a visiting presidential history display that goes around the country. It came to Grand Rapids, and they had 2 or 3 items, personal items of every president. And one of the things they had of Taft's was the bathtub that they had to build for him. It looks like a swimming pool for this 350-pound president. But anyway, Cleveland, I think of him as, more than any other president perhaps, as having a core gut set of principles that he just stood by, that governed his thinking and his policy making time and time again, and I admire him for that. He was not college educated, he wasn't an economist, but he almost always came to the right conclusions on policy matters because he saw everything in terms of what was right and what was wrong. And he drew from the sturdy character that was imbued into him by his parents from an early age. And time and again, you see in the way he addresses policy matters, he calls forth from deep within a wellspring of character that he had in him, those principles that allowed him to come to the right conclusions. He vetoed more bills than all the previous 21 presidents combined. He was 4 square, solidly, time and again, for sound money, limited government, low taxes, individual liberty, freedom to trade. And why? Not because he read Adam Smith, I don't know that he ever did, but because He drew from what the principles of right and wrong. When he addressed the tariff question, why was he opposed to high tariffs? Well, he could have offered all sorts of economic analysis and done studies and what have you, but no, Grover Cleveland said, wait a minute, tariffs are nothing more than the cynical use of the political force of government by some to stick it to their competitors. So that's wrong. So I'm against it. Why was he in favor of sound money and against the move to try to inflate the currency? Because he thought sound money was honest money. Sound money means you don't cheat people. Inflation means you're cheating them. You're robbing them of their savings. You're applying false wage. You're lying. So we don't do that. He once said, patriotism is no substitute for a sound currency. He was a man of solid principle. America had a chance to grab Hawaii in the 1880s. In fact, his predecessor, Benjamin Harrison, that is to say, predecessor before the second Cleveland term, he connived with some American interests in Hawaii to sort of grab the Hawaiian Islands and put an agreement of annexation before the Congress. And it sat there when Grover Cleveland took office. He immediately rejected it. He said, it's not the business of the U.S. government to run around the world engineering overthrows to grab somebody's territory, so we'll leave Hawaii to the Hawaiians. Not for long, unfortunately. But anyway, Grover Cleveland took that firm and principled stand, even in his foreign policy. He didn't always come to the right conclusion, but 99% of the time he did. One of my favorite vetoes by Grover Cleveland was of the so-called Texas Seed Bill of 1886. This bill would have appropriated $10,000, the equivalent of about $2 million today, to help drought-stricken farmers in Texas. And he vetoed it, and in his veto message he said, though the people may support the government, it's not the duty of the government to support the people. And in times of distress, and he was a Democrat, he said, in times of distress, we have to rely upon the charity of our fellow citizens. They will rise to the occasion and assist others around them. We don't need to launder their money through a federal bureaucracy. He wasn't the kind of president who would show up demagogically at the scene of a tragedy and say, hey, folks, I'm going to do something for you. I'll get somebody else's money in here for you. He would say, here's an occasion to help. It didn't occur to him that it should be run through Washington through an expensive bureaucracy and pay them a brokerage fee for helping people in distress. That's the kind of character Grover Cleveland had. He was solid, and he let his principles determine where he stood on public policy. You know, if I think of what would Grover have done on the issue of the stimulus package, I think it's pretty easy to see. I think I can hear Grover saying, well, is it right to take $1 from the innocent and give it to the guilty? Is it right to take $1 from the irresponsible, or from the responsible and give it to the irresponsible? He would say, well, of course not. Is there anything about doing that 1 trillion times that would make it right? He would say, no, you're just 1 trillion times more wrong. So he would allow fundamental principles of justice and rightness and wrongness determine where he wouldn't say, well, let's see, let's take a vote, or let's see, how about this group over here? Would you like to have it done? Oh, well, okay. Or what do we have to do to get reelected? We'll do that. To him, it was a sacred duty to do what the Constitution of the United States said the president had to do, which is a few minimal things and otherwise get off their backs, out of their way, and out of their pockets. A man of principle and one of America's greatest presidents because of that principle. Well, I need to wind my way to a conclusion here, but I want to give you a couple other examples. I mentioned self-reliance. How many of you know Fanny Crosby, or know who she was? Anybody? Fanny Crosby? Okay. It's a sad commentary that so few, if this were an American audience, I'd have about the same response. Fanny Crosby was to this day, though she died in 1915, holds the record in all of world history for having written more lyrics to more songs than any other human being. They were virtually all hymns. She wrote more than 8,000 of them on any given Sunday, at least across America, probably hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Americans singing Fanny Crosby hymns. She was the first woman to address the United States Congress. She knew, either during their presidencies or afterwards, every single American president, from John Quincy Adams in the 1820s to Woodrow Wilson in the early part of the 20th century. You add that up, that's half of all the people who have been American presidents. She knew them personally. It might not be an exaggeration to say that she knew more American presidents than any other American, living or dead. That tells you something of her fame in her day. She was regarded as a saint and a wonderful example by many Americans. When I should tell you that what makes her story all the more remarkable is that Fanny Crosby never had any recollection of having seen anything, because she was blind from the age of 6 months. And when she spoke to the United States Congress, she didn't say, her message was not, hey, I'm a disadvantaged minority, where's my check? Her message was, you can overcome any obstacle if you put your mind to it. And a barrier in your life is not a reason to stake a claim on another. It's a reason to step up your character and your actions. Do the best you can with what you've got. And don't assume that because you've got a problem that it's proper for somebody to take from someone else and give it to you. And yet today, the typical history text in America that kids are learning from never mentions Fanny Crosby. First woman to it. Do you think she'd be mentioned if her message was, hey, women's rights, give us some programs and spend more money for this or that? But she's forgotten. And yet she was a woman of enormously profound fame in her day. I mentioned optimism. Optimism. And you might wonder, well, why is that an important character or virtue of character? Why should it matter to your character if you're optimistic or pessimistic? Well, I'm thinking in terms of the kind of character that is most attractive to people you want to convince about liberty. So that's why it's important to me. And I think optimism is essential. I can think of too many times in history where people faced greater odds, obstacles and barriers, threats and dangers than we do today. They didn't give up. They persevered. And in some cases, and I'll give you a story this afternoon about one of them, they changed the world in the process. Optimism. You have to be optimistic. Because if you're not, what happens? If you're pessimistic, then you don't work very hard, do you? And you certainly don't attract other people to your cause. I mean, how exciting would it be if I got up in front of an audience like this and said, well, we're probably not going to win this, we're going down for sure, but I want to sign you up anyway and we'll have fun along the way. I mean, that's not very inspiring. You better get optimistic and find a way to convey that to others, because people want to know that they're signing up for a winning cause. It's not only right, it will ultimately prevail. For me, I have to say that comes very naturally, and I'm not sure why. But at the various organizations I've worked with, from a university to 2 think tanks now over the years, I've always had others on staff feel the need to kind of temper my optimism. And so we end up with a pretty good compliment, I think, of maybe being a little more realistic. But for me, optimism comes naturally. I've always been the kind of person who, without even thinking, tends to see the glass half full. And this was confirmed for me in February of 1980. I was driving to the university where I taught on one very icy morning, and there was a car coming the other way. He had stopped to make a left, waiting for me to come through, but then at the last second decided he had enough time and he veered left right in front of me, and I swerved to miss him, lost control of the car on the ice, and it headed down into the ravine, a rather deep one on one side of the road, and completely flipped upside down and ended at the bottom of the ravine upside down. I remember vividly how I felt and what I thought as the car was rolling over, like it was yesterday. In fact, it still, to this day, I wouldn't say it troubles me, but it makes me realize how abnormal or weird I am. Because I remember being totally calm about it. Not the slightest bit shaken whatsoever, completely serene about it. And as it flipped over, I thought, I'm going to get a new car out of this. and I did. I did get a new car. It was an old, ugly Ford Fairmont. It was time for it to go anyway. But in fact, I had to calm down the other guy. The window on my side had broken out, and I crawled out, and I was still chugging for a few seconds, I recall. And I crawled up the ravine, and he was up there all shaken up. I had to calm him down. But optimism is important. If we had a day just to talk about why you should be optimistic about liberty, I'd love to address that. Maybe we can touch on it during the day, but I would hope you can find reason to be optimistic, and for that optimism then to come across in all that you say and that you do, so that you can win others to the cause. It's important. Pessimism won't win anybody. Well, I'll end with a word about a long-term focus, because that was one of the virtues that I mentioned. Long-term focus. What do we mean by that? I think a person of character is not enraptured by the here and now, but is able to stand apart from the tumult of the moment and think of the big picture for all people for the longer term. That's an attribute. There's so many people who are so caught up in maybe just themselves or just those around and just the exigencies of the moment, that they don't plan for the long term, they don't think about it, they don't try to push anything in the right direction for the long term, they're just so caught up in the here and now. A person of character thinks long term, and sometimes that even means that he sacrifices a short-term gain to achieve a greater long-term benefit. It sometimes means putting yourself on the line and taking great risk for something that may not even bear fruit for a long time, maybe not even in your lifetime. One of the most, I mentioned earlier, sir, after you spoke, that I was going to say something about Poland. The most inspirational moments of my life have come from my foreign travels to about 70 countries. And of those, I have to say that probably the most inspirational came from Poland, 1986. This was a dark time for Poland. If you recall, the Solidarity was born in 1978 and grew from a small labor union in Gdansk to a bit of a mixed bag, but largely a pro-liberty movement of disparate elements, moving Poland towards such things as freedoms of speech and assembly and the political process against Soviet wishes. And if you recall back in that time in the early 80s, as Solidarity rose, there were increasing stories, or not stories, but rumors that maybe the Soviets were going to do here what they did in Czechoslovakia and in Hungary. Maybe they'll invade to put a stop to this. How can they allow one of their satellite countries to break away and establish these freedoms that threaten the monopoly of the Communist Party? And so all during this period, in the early 80s, we watched as Poland moved, took one step after another towards exerting their liberties. And then in December of '81, the Soviets didn't invade, but they certainly put the heat on their stooges in Warsaw, the communist regime there, to crack down. And in December of '81, suddenly martial law was declared, the tanks went into the streets, the water cannons, thousands were rounded up and arrested, some disappeared. And Poland descended into a dark night of nearly a decade of the reassertion of communist dictatorship. I was there in 1986, spending 2 weeks with people who were active in the anti-communist, underground, pro-liberty resistance. Amazed and stunned and motivated immensely to this day by the actions of these very, very brave people who are putting everything on the line. Every night I was put up in the home of a different family who did not, contrary to the law, report that a foreigner was staying with them. Moved around, hopefully one step ahead of the police during my whole visit, as people who were active in the resistance were showing me what people were doing who believed in liberty in Poland. One night, in fact, there was a nest of underground printers who had a dinner party for me. And I'll never forget this, to be entertained by these people who were actively and illegally translating great works of liberty from the West and distributing them throughout Poland, taking great risk, and then have them show me stacks of this stuff. I mean, works by Mises and Rothbard, even The Mystery of Banking, which had just come out. I had just gotten my own copy back in the States, and here it was already in Poland by Murray Rothbard. Free to Choose, or Capitalism and Freedom. Yeah, it was Capitalism and Freedom by Friedman that they had, and stacks of this stuff. And I asked them a lot of questions, including one, where do you guys get all this paper? Where do you get the paper to print this stuff? The government owns all the printing presses. And a young man named Pavel answered, and he said, and the Poles have a great sense of humor, he said, well, we get it from two places. One, we smuggle it in from the West, and two, we steal it from communists. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, the government's got its factories where they make their magazines and newspapers, but most of the workers now think like we do, and they smuggle the government's paper out to us, and sometimes when it's really clear, they've been known to publish our stuff on the government's own printing press. And then another evening, my host said, we want you to meet this couple, Zbigniew Romaszewski and his wife, Sophia. I'd never heard of them. They had run underground radio for Solidarity during the first 6 months of martial law, until they were arrested for running that clandestine radio. He was given 4 years in prison, she was given 3. They were kept in solitary confinement apart from each other for much of that time, beaten on many occasions. And here I was in their apartment in November of '86, not long after either of them had been let out. They were active again on behalf of the anti-communist resistance, knowing that at any time the government could round them up, beat down their door, and haul them off to jail. It didn't matter to them, because liberty meant everything to them. It was that important. Liberty, they would say, makes all the difference in the world. Without it, life is hardly worth living. So of course you do what you can on its behalf, no matter what the odds. They had a long-term focus. You could say to them, but you're up against the Army, Navy, and the Air Force of the Soviet Empire. How can you prevail? Didn't matter. It wasn't like, well, if we don't win by a certain date, we're going to quit. They didn't care. They knew what was right. They had the courage and the long-term focus to commit to it, and they were going to do all they could on its behalf. I asked them, well, when you were broadcasting on the radio, how did you know if people were listening? And Sophia answered this way. She said, we wondered ourselves, of course, not knowing. We had to set up shop, run the radio, and then for only 8 or 10 minutes at a time, then we had to dismantle, go someplace else, so as to not be traced. But one evening while we were broadcasting, we said to people, if you believe in liberty for Poland, the message of this radio, go to your, blink your lights, she said, and call your friends and relatives who think the same way, and ask them to do the same, blink their lights. And she then told me, we then went to the window, and for hours, all of Warsaw was blinking. It was 2.5 years later when the communist dictator, General Jaruzelski, had that electrifying news conference where he said to the world, Poland is going to have free elections for the first time in decades, in June of this year, June of '89. And he was peppered with questions. Why? Why is Poland doing this? First big crack in the Eastern European empire of the Soviet Union. And he said, because Poland has become ungovernable. And I knew exactly what he meant. That was another way of saying, try as we might, these people just won't listen to us. They really believe in something else. And we try to tell them what we think is best for them, and 38 million of them are thumbing their noses at us because they have courage, they have principle, they're self-reliant, they have a long-term focus, they're optimistic, they believe in the principles of liberty. He didn't put it that way, but that's the way I translated it. What can we do? Those of us who believe in liberty, I think first and foremost must serve as good examples, people of solid character. so that when people see you as an exponent of liberty, they don't see you as, well, you know, I know what his real motives are. It's a lot less lofty than that. You need to talk the talk and walk the talk and be a good example in every aspect of life that will cause others to be attracted to you, to want to know more about your message. So the power of example, serving as a person of character first and foremost, I think is indispensable to the success of liberty. You must ask questions of conscience and of character of those who seek to represent you. And do it in a very public way. When you are meeting with your legislator, don't ask about, you know, what are you going to get from me, or you need to ask questions that prick the consciences of those who want to represent you. And you need to make it clear that you don't support people who lack character, who think that government is an engine of theft on behalf of those who say, I need it more than you do, or I want it more badly than you do. You need to raise these questions of character. You need to tie character to sound policy. What we have to do ultimately as believers in liberty is to change the zeitgeist so that if we're in an assembly of like a town hall and all kinds of people together and somebody says, hey, I think we ought to have a government program for this or that, we need to change the zeitgeist so that most of the crowd then turns to that person and says, what? You want to call the cops to do it? If you're really for it, why would you want to call the cops? Why would you want to use force to get it done? That's ugly. What's wrong with you? What happened to your character? You want this so badly you're willing to get it at gunpoint? Oh, we need to have the general public response be the same kind of response you get when somebody in a crowd expels gas, if you know what I'm talking about. We must demand integrity of those who wish to serve, to represent us, and support those who are raising the alarm and are trying to get this message out. If that sounds like a selfless urge to think of FEE as an organization to support, well, I guess it is. I hope you'll consider that. And finally, let me share with you the words of George Washington that appear on the fireplace, above the fireplace, in the library at the Foundation for Economic Education. I wish every person in public office would seek to carry out what Washington is saying here. That quote reads, if to please the people we offer what we ourselves disapprove, how can we afterward defend our work? Let us raise a standard to which the wise and honest can repair. The rest is in the hands of God. Thank you very much for being so attentive. How are we on time?
Very good. You can have questions for maybe half an hour or something.
Okay. Any questions? Yes, ma'am. Was I wearing my seatbelt?
Your car flipped over.
Yeah, I think I probably was.
And was there government legislation?
People use the mic.
Oh. Was there government legislation? I think it was mandatory at that time. If I wore one, it was probably not because of that. It was maybe more out of force of habit, but I think I did have one on. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Your basic message here really resonates, and I have a particular, maybe pragmatic question. I've noticed a tendency for some of the people that I know, with the type of good character that you refer to perhaps let their humility have them be less obvious, less well known than they might otherwise be. On the other hand, there are people with less character and less humility who stand out more as a result. And this may seem to work against the hope that the good character can spread and result in a society of good character. So I wonder if you might just speak to that concern a little bit.
Humility, specifically.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the spread of character, the spread of good character.
Okay.
How those two interact.
Okay. In my mind, Ability, you know, a person who accomplishes great things, I wouldn't say, you know, hide your light under a basket and don't tell anybody about it, but it's easy to cross the line and become excessively boastful. And if it goes beyond that and makes you think as though you're just so good that you can actually now begin to tell other people how to live their lives, that's where humility gives way to this condescending and very arrogant central planning mode. If central planner types were really humble, appropriately humble, what I'm saying is they would have suddenly realized, gee, I really don't know as much as I think I know. I thought I knew how to plan out the lives of other people, but really that's kind of preposterous. I really don't. I'm having enough trouble running my own, let alone trying to plan for 300 million other people. That's why I'm saying about humility. A person of character who has a measure of humility will quickly come to the conclusion that he or she cannot, there are some things he or she doesn't know, can't do. Doesn't mean he shouldn't reach for the stars. But it does suggest in the areas of at least political philosophy, the humble approach is one that says, I really think we need to let people be themselves, go as far as their talents can take them, because there's nothing I know about their lives that will allow me to live them for them better than they can live them themselves. I don't know if that really answers it for you,
A little.
but okay, I'll keep working on it. Hi, Mary Lou.
Hi, Mary, thanks for coming up. The whole issue of what to do next, you were talking about trees and forests and character being the issue. People are tempted to be active in politics as a form of activism. And I know that you have a political background too, but you chose to go with the educational side for your life. So can you talk a little bit about political action versus education and how they might merge together?
Yes, political action and education. This is a choice that everybody, individually, each person has to decide, you know, where is my strength? And I readily concede that although I want a far smaller role in our lives for politics, somebody has to be in politics if we're ever to dismantle the harmful programs and policies and directions that we have. So I don't frown necessarily on someone choosing to go that route, as long as they maintain their principles and don't suddenly get so sucked into the political maelstrom that they lose those principles and think that the most important goal in life is to get reelected rather than stand for something. I made a personal choice after dabbling in politics once. I ran for Congress. I was the Republican nominee in 1982 for a congressional seat. I tried it and I thought afterwards, well, that was fun. I don't regret having tried it and I don't regret having lost. But for me, I thought the world of ideas would be a better application of my interests and talents. I could do more in what I've done subsequently than if I had been elected. I think I would have been very frustrated in Congress, but I'm glad there are good people like a Ron Paul who, you know, are voices in that wilderness. But it's really a personal choice. Ultimately, though, politics rests. What's accomplished in politics rests upon what we've accomplished in the educational sphere. Few politicians will lead society into new directions. Most of them, you know, put their wet finger in the air and march out in front of the mob and say, "I'm your leader." So it's up to us to get the wind blown in the right direction, and then politics and politicians will generally follow thereafter. So I think education is more important, ultimately, but even the best of politicians, I think, would admit to that. Ron Paul would be the first to tell you that, yeah, he could do more if more people across the country were educated into these ideas and would be with him on these things. Yes, sir?
First, a comment on politics and politicians, and I think it's an issue that we have in both of our countries. I think fundamentally it cannot be realistic to expect the pigs to destroy the trough.
Yeah, good way to put it. He who robs Peter to pay Paul can usually count on the support of Paul.
But as a question, I think as I'm sure many other people, struggle with the issue of self-reliance, independence, freedom, and some of the realities of life. We see homeless people, and I understand there's more of a problem that you have than we have here, and yet it is very serious here. If there are homeless people and they are living on the streets, then I think it's fair to say that society has failed them, because nobody is going out to take them off the streets, which is the ideal in a fully independent environment in which people will see a problem and solve it without government interference. So if the people are not doing that, is it not a government responsibility to pick up that challenge and do something about it?
Let me answer that by starting with a statement you made that society has failed them. I want to dig into that just a little bit, because what you're saying in effect is, let's say we've got about 60 people here, let's say one of them here is homeless and the rest constitute society. You are saying that it's the fault of, or the failure of, the other folks in the room that person is homeless. And I'm not prepared to quickly jump to that conclusion. As I looked a little more deeply, if I start doing interviews, I'd say, well, what'd you do to cause that person's homelessness? What'd you do? And pretty soon you'd find, hey, an awful lot of people here would be hard put to say why what they did caused that person's homelessness at all. And maybe if I interview the homeless person, I might find some problems in their behavior that contributed to it. I'm not going to let him off the hook just because he's homeless. And in fact, we have found time and again that a not insignificant portion of the homeless are homeless because of some poor decisions they have made. So that's where I'd start. I don't buy into your premise that if this guy's homeless, it's everybody else's fault.
Maybe this isn't true in the United States, but certainly in Vancouver, something around 60% or more of the homeless have mental issues.
Yeah.
And are not able to make reasonable decisions for themselves because of those issues.
Or drug or alcohol problems.
Right.
That's right. And so it's hard for me to say it's your fault, even though you never took a drug or got drunk, that this guy did. So I'd be hesitant to blame society. I'd like to know who you're talking about and what's the penalty we should assess if we're going to blame them for that guy's problem. But there's multiple aspects to this too. You cannot start from the assumption that if you've got a problem, well then it must be, free people must be at the root of the problem. You know, I'm amazed at how many problems in society we solve even though government at all levels is taking a record share of our incomes. It's taken like 40, in the United States, I think it's higher here, it takes 40% of all of our incomes. So I'm not all that surprised that, yeah, there are problems that don't go away. I wonder how many more problems would we have if it took 60%, 80%, 90% of our income. So the problems wouldn't go away, they'd only accelerate because you and I wouldn't have the wherewithal to help those in our midst. So a lot of time we kind of start from the assumption, we got a problem, must be free people, it's got the answer is more government. As if a government program doesn't itself have problems. You know, for years we were sold in the United States on the idea that the welfare state, the Great Society, would help people. We spent $5 trillion in welfare programs up until 1996, when even a Democratic president finally signed a bill that ended the federal entitlement to welfare. And why? Not because you know, getting government to retreat was somehow, well, let me put it this way. It was largely because studies time and time again said, here's what we got for our money. We're breaking families apart. We're making generations, one after another, perpetually dependent upon the dole. We're taxing the life out of enterprise so that new jobs aren't being created that would allow some of these folks to find employment. So, but we often talk about, here's a problem, just have a government program and the problem will go away. No, the government program itself is fraught with problems. That's why in America, at least, we finally said enough of that stuff on a grand scale and said, it ain't working. We've caused more problems trying to fix them through government than if we'd left them in the hands of free people in the first place. I'll go back to what I said at the start. There's nothing about being in government that suddenly makes you more compassionate or careful with other people's money or caring about those in need than the folks who sent you there. And part of the revival of character in any country, I think, has to be the recognition that if you're concerned about poor people, it's not a mark of character to expect the government to solve that problem for you. It's an abandonment of character. You know, we can stand back and say, well, I really care for people because I'm for government programs. I don't see that as a mark of character. I see that as, that's another way of saying, I like to pontificate, but I really don't have the character it takes to actually solve the problem myself. I'm just going to pawn it off on the politicians. That's what that reduces to. The welfare state is not an exhibition of compassion. It is an exhibition of abandonment of responsibility. It's the cheap way out. It's the way of saying, I'm better than you because I want government programs, but when it comes down to it, you probably aren't doing squat yourself to help people truly in need. You find that time and again in America, the biggest advocates of ever more government, you find the way they behave in their personal lives, they don't give squat time and again to actually help people. They much prefer to just talk about it and expect the government to solve it. And that's not a mark of character. Khalid.
Larry, we've seen over the past few decades, indeed through the 20th century, the size of the state, spending, taxation go up. You cited that as evidence of decline in character. You looked at evidence of high school seniors. I think probably a lot of us accept that there has been a decline in character in recent decades, perhaps throughout the 20th century, maybe longer. What's the reason for this? Is it something to do with, in the Western world, increasing wealth, family structure, ideology? Why are we seeing this?
I've wrestled with this too. What is the reason for this decline in character? And I can't point to any one source. I can point to multiple possible causes that maybe together are working to undermine this. You mentioned wealth. Wealth per se, there's nothing evil about wealth per se, but there is something inherently tempting about it. It does take strong character to resist some of the temptations that come with wealth. And it's apparent when you look at, say, Hollywood, that there are a lot of people who can't handle great wealth. They do allow it to corrupt their character. And they think it's the source of happiness, and in no time at all they discover it isn't, and they're miserable, even though they're super wealthy. So wealth is a temptation that requires that you work harder at maintaining your character, but the fact is, maybe there's just a lot of people who can't handle it, and that's part of the problem. Another problem is this, the moral relativism that has arisen in our educational system and in philosophical corners of the country, the notion that anything goes, no absolutes. And this is not a religious statement, just the notion that whether you are have a religious faith or do not, the notion that there just aren't solid absolute truths that we can know has become very pervasive. Anything goes. Well, whatever you think, it's just as good as what anybody else thinks. There's no absolutes, no anchors, no standards by which we judge ideas, because everything goes. That has been very harmful, I think, and that's been very, very pervasive. An entire philosophy built around it that has eaten into the vitals of this country, and you find time and again that young people growing up, you see how it's affected them. They think in terms of, there's no real right or wrong. It's whatever seems to work for you. I don't think you can have a free society when people think that way. And all of a sudden, what becomes their standard? What makes them happy for the moment? And if that means taking something from somebody else, that's okay. Serves my end. That's only a partial answer, Colleen, but I do think that's where we need the greatest area of discussion. What is the source of this problem? I know more about what the answer is. First of all, we have to recognize it's a problem, and then embrace the virtues we know to be true, and then think about ways in which we inculcate them and practice them and serve them by our example. Yes, Aaron?
In partial answer to Colleen's question, I'm wondering if perhaps the culprit isn't democracy. Maybe I'm playing now into the hands of Walter Block's Belief in Anarchy, but Hans Hermann Hopp's book is worth a read, I think, on this topic. It's called Democracy, the God That Failed. And what he argues, one of the things he argues, is that democracy in itself leads to the corrosion of character, partly because of the last virtue that you identified was the looking ahead, forward thinking, making sacrifices today for the future. Democracy encourages us to do exactly the opposite, to consume today's capital, and because every politician that gets voted in must, during the 4 years he's in office, mine the plunder as much as he can because he's going to be out of office, and that's Herman Hopp's thesis. So perhaps that's a partial explanation. And I'd like to comment also on another thread that you mentioned about, what was the thread now? About the gentleman that talked about the homeless situation in Vancouver. Maybe it's caused by government programs, and the crowding out effect, as we refer to in economics, is that public welfare, the welfare state, crowds out private charity. And so many times, personally, you walk by somebody with a tin cup, you take the attitude, well, I'd like to help you, but there's a social program that'll take care of that, and I'm resolved to.
That's right.
And one last point, if I might, is on your sort of central thesis, as I see it, that character begets freedom, or is necessary to freedom. There are some people that are arguing, I'm thinking of Deirdre McCloskey's book on capitalism, something that to the effect of virtues for an age of commerce, where she argues that capitalism itself creates the characteristics that you're looking for. So when we foster a capitalist free enterprise system, it develops exactly those characters.
Yes, I agree with that. In fact, I don't think you said anything I would disagree with. You made a lot of good points, Aaron, and I'll comment on the second one about government policy actually causing problems like homelessness. I just moved from the state of Michigan to Georgia. And in Michigan, of course, the largest city is Detroit. It is a city that ought to be a shining city on the socialist hill. I mean, nobody of anything but a strong government planning mentality has been elected to any significant office in that city in 40 years. And they spend enormous amounts of money. Washington, D.C. is another great example. I mean, it's full of government employees. They spend enormous amounts of sums of money. The government is in every corner of life. Well, why aren't they beautiful examples of utopia? In fact, they're disasters. In Detroit, there are homeless people. But I look at the fact that Detroit has a property tax burden that's 3 times the average for Michigan municipalities in the same state. It's 3 times the burden of other municipalities in the state. But why would anybody even stay there? They even have a law in, how many of you heard of Berry Gordy, Motown Records? Okay, you may know, he started that in his home in downtown Detroit many years ago. It's now a museum. He lives in California. He fled Michigan. And maybe he'll flee California as things continue to deteriorate there. But he started Motown Records in his home. Do you know that there's now an ordinance in the city of Detroit that in a blanket fashion bans home-based businesses? If that had been in place when Berry Gordy tried to start Motown Records, he'd been run out of town. You have endless interventions like that, massive tax burdens, and then we say, homeless people. Well, of course, you just manufactured them with government policy. So the problem is often not so much what new program can we give to these people, it's rather what old programs can we get rid of so as to stop festering the problem. Next. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry.
I would like to just sort of follow up on a couple of things that have come up while I've been standing there. One is about the sort of source of the loss of character, and whether the welfare state crowds out private charity. A friend of mine spends a lot of time in the U.S., and one observation she's made is how much more prevalent volunteerism is in the U.S. than in Canada, and there may indeed be, I think, something to that. What actually prompted me to stand up was your comment about European socialism. This is something I struggled with for a long time, because my parents are German immigrants. They grew up in Nazi Germany. They were teenagers at the time, forced to join the Hitler Youth, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, they have always been very strong socialists, which I also alluded to earlier. And our entire social circle of elderly Europeans are socialist identified. And so socialism has always been a good thing. And it was a real mental jump for me as I began to understand what socialism, how socialism breeds bureaucracy. For me, that was, as I said, my learning curve. And I think one thing that you said really twigged for me, which is, because I simply couldn't understand how socialism could be both a good thing and a bad thing, and how people that I respected and who had a huge amount of understanding were somehow still held enthralled by it for some reason. I think one thing that you said really kind of lit it up for me, which is that you have an assumption that your view of socialism, the European view of socialism, is based on the assumption, the presumption, the existence of a peasant class. A peasant class which absolutely has no ability to fend for itself, which systemically is completely
example people who understand that.
Yes, and I think it's systemic. It grows. Perhaps, I mean, maybe you can enlighten me politically as to where this peasant class would, or why it would still exist in Europe. But I don't believe it exists in North America. And I think that what we have in North America, a lot of the needy people whose needs are used to argue for large bureaucratically run programs, there's an element of willfulness in those needs. So, for example, I mean, just to take a sort of very current example, I live near Commercial Drive, and so on Commercial Drive you have these kids sitting there begging, and they've got 18 piercings, their hair is blue and in a mohawk, they're wearing their pants down to here, and they're wearing a, you know, if they don't have the mohawk, they have the hoodie, whatever they have, but they're clearly unemployable. So they're sitting there begging, and you sort of think, well, okay, how much of what makes you unemployable is actually kind of like you could take a bath and it would go away.
You could do something about
so,
it.
you know, you're making yourself unemployable, and then you're telling me that you're unemployed, and therefore you need a help. Now, I'm sure they have other reasons for being unemployed, and you know, one isn't devoid of empathy in many cases. But when all those barriers to employment or to self-care exist and are evidently willful, that's when you have to recognize that there's something different about still a large bureaucratic system that would say, but we must help these poor people on the street, which takes me to homelessness, where also, especially in Vancouver, a large part of what drives homelessness is addiction. And the addiction, sustained over the long term, as many of our programs do, eventually leads to mental health. And so now we're being told that we have all these mental health problems on the street. It's not about addiction, it's about mental health. But there's a chicken and egg thing going on.
Yeah.
So again, we have a huge component of willfulness in the needy people who we are allegedly supposed to help through government programs. So this, to me, the issue of willfulness to me is the divide that makes European socialism not translatable directly to the North American context. And that's just, I wanted to stand up and say that in case it's helpful for somebody else, because for me, this is something I've been struggling with for a long time in sort of translating my parents' native politics to the present day. So that's sort of.
Well, I think you've got a good point there. I think there is a tendency, I'm not sure what the explanation for it might be, but there's a greater tendency in North America to want to assign responsibility, to the extent you can reasonably do so, for a person's actions or situation, to the person himself. Whereas in Europe, there does seem to be more of kind of an acceptance of whatever circumstance he or she finds himself in. We sort of take it as granted, and the rest of us have to figure out what to do for him. I think in North America there is a sense that says, you know, hey, let's first find out what about that person's behavior really is contributing to the problem and ought to be changed before we pin the blame on other people.
Yeah, I mean, again, my parents will always put money in somebody's tin cup because the assumption that that person would not be standing on the street if they had any other options is so deeply ingrained in them.
Yeah.
And it's an understanding that some people are actually choosing to stand on the street side with the tin cup rather than doing something else that I think creates a subtle shift. So
Yeah.
anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Let's take one last question from Lilia, and then I have a couple closing comments, and then I think we will probably be over time.
I worked with the homeless here in Vancouver, and I worked with welfare departments in New York City, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and the U.S. And I have to say that I found it very intriguing to hear that capitalism actually may produce the characteristics of moral people. And I've seen it in the work. I've worked in the housing that the city and the province provide here for the homeless, and particularly in Vancouver. And there's another way of looking at it. There are some people, and it may be through drugs, through whatever situation, they don't like to live by the bourgeois rules. When you live in an apartment, in a housing program, there are certain rules you have to follow. You can't do everything you want, you can't do the drugs, you can't bring in prostitutes and upset the people next door and so on. So they often get evicted. And they find that it's actually freer. Some have told me that they found Stanley Park a much nicer place to live in than all those terrible housing programs that have rules that infringe upon their rights. And another reason why there are mentally ill who are homeless is because of the left-wing ideas that mental hospitals were oppressive institutions and that people with mental illness were just like anybody else and they should live in the community. And so they were closing, in the US and here, they were closing down mental hospitals. And I was one of the people interviewing people at Riverview and asking where would they want to live and helping them get out into the community. And one thing about Vancouver, it has one of the best housing programs for the mentally ill in the world. We had people from Japan and Europe come and study our program, but it's never enough. It's because you don't pay for it, somebody else pays for it, you don't look after it, you trash the place often. It's a complicated situation. So I don't think somebody else is to blame. I agree with you, because someone else is having problems. It is the decision of many people, and I don't think you can make somebody else happy. You cannot put them in a situation and think that you provide everything, that they will appreciate it, they will do good things with it. Maybe some will, but unfortunately the way human nature is, whatever is free, they think it's free, but it's somebody else. It's waitresses, miners, everyone else. People I've known who receive welfare say, well, I haven't found a job that satisfies me, that I like. Well, gee, I've found few jobs like that. And it's the assumption that I should only do what I want to do and not what the community needs, what the needs are. Often they're very difficult jobs, and you have to do difficult things to make life better. But I think it's the responsibility of all of us.
Thank you, Lillian. Well, you've been a very, very patient, considerate group. We've been here, you in seats and me behind the podium for a couple hours now. I appreciate your being so attentive and so patient. Obviously, we don't all agree on everything, but that's the health of a free society, isn't it? And we are dealing with and raising issues today that often are sloughed off as unimportant. but we know, I think all of us here of whatever persuasion, that these are very important ideas that need to be wrestled with. I just want to say in conclusion a few words about fee, hoping that you may visit our website and learn more about what we do. We have two websites, in fact. The main site will take you to the second one. The main site is fee.org. It's a treasure trove of commentary and articles and, that are refreshed every weekday. We publish a magazine called The Freeman 10 times a year. It has its own website, thefreemanonline.org, but that's harder to remember, so just if you go to fee.org, you'll see the link to the Freeman page. We have a Fee Facebook fan page I would encourage you to consider signing up for. We don't inundate you with posts, but what we put up there I think you'll find to be very interesting. How many of you are on Facebook? Oh, okay, well let me also extend an invitation. I would be delighted if you sent a friend invite to me. I have my own Facebook page and I'm in a contest with a friend, so I need more friends.
What are you up to?
What's that?
What are you up to?
I just crossed the 3,500 mark, and I'm way ahead of him, but I like to stay ahead of him. So I would be honored if you sent a Facebook friend invite either to me or to the Fee page or both. Thank you, and I look forward to being with you again this afternoon for the second presentation.